There is a pattern in history that has erased the debts of the world's most powerful empires without a single official default. In 64 AD, Rome faced obligations it could no longer pay, and within decades, its silver coins had lost more than half their value. In 1797, Britain quietly suspended gold convertibility, and over the next 20 years, its wartime debts were diluted through inflation. In 1971, the United States closed the gold window, and the dollar you held before that moment was never worth the same again. Different centuries, different systems, same result. And right now in 2025, the United States is following the exact same pattern. And here's what should terrify you. This time the numbers are larger, the system is faster, and the consequences reach every savings account on Earth. This is the story of how governments erase debt without ever saying the word default, and how the Fed is invisibly erasing $38 trillion in debt fits into a pattern as old as empire itself. Before we go through this pattern, you need to understand what debt erasure actually means. Not in textbooks and practice. This isn't just about government balance sheets or abstract monetary theory. It is about how states survive when the promises they've made exceed what their economies can produce. At first, debt looks manageable. Interest rates are low, growth is strong, confidence is high. But then obligations compound. Wars, crises, demographic shifts, political promises. When the numbers no longer add up, there are only 4 options. Default outright, raise taxes dramatically, cut spending brutally, or change the value of the money itself. That last option is the one almost every major power chooses. Not openly, not honestly, invisibly. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens through policy decisions that seem technical, temporary, even boring. But when this phenomenon unfolds, it doesn't stay contained. It spills into prices, wages, savings, and social stability. That's not theoretical. That's documented history. Rome did it. Britain did it. The United States has done it before. Let me show you how it happened 3 times already and why it's happening again now. Let's start with Rome. By the year 14 AD, at the height of Augustus's reign, Rome controlled territory from Britain to Egypt. Its economy was vast for its time, powered by conquest, tribute, and trade. The Roman state promised its soldiers land, pensions, and pay. It promised grain to citizens. It promised security across thousands of miles of frontier. All of that cost money. In the 1st century, the primary silver coin, the denarius, contained about 3.9 grams of silver. That coin was the backbone of Roman finance, but expenses kept rising. By 54 AD, under Emperor Nero, Rome faced a fiscal crisis driven by military spending and reconstruction after the Great Fire of 64 AD. Nero made a decision. He reduced the silver content of the denarius to roughly 3.4 grams. It was subtle. Most people didn't notice at first, but the precedent was set. By 100 AD, under Trajan, military campaigns expanded further. Dacia, Parthia, constant war. The silver content fell again. By 200 AD, during the reign of Septimius Severus, the denarius contained less than 2 grams of silver. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Severus raised their wages by 50%. The money came from debasement. Prices rose. Confidence eroded. By 268 AD, during the crisis of the 3rd century, the silver content had fallen below 5%. Coins were silver in name only. The state had erased its debts by changing the money. The consequence was inflation so severe that taxes were demanded in goods instead of currency. Trade collapsed. The empire fractured. That's what invisible debt erasure looks like. Let's jump forward more than 1,500 years. Britain, in the late 18th century, was the world's dominant power. By 1793, it was locked in a life and death struggle with revolutionary France. War is expensive. By 1797, Britain's national debt exceeded 200% of GDP. Gold reserves drained rapidly. In February 1797, the Bank of England suspended the convertibility of paper notes into gold. Officially, it was temporary. Unofficially, it was a turning point. Britain began financing war through paper money. Between 1797 and 1815, the money supply more than doubled. Prices rose roughly 30%. Just like Rome, the debt wasn't erased through default. It was diluted. Bondholders were paid back in pounds, worth less than the pounds they had lent. Just like Rome, the state survived. And just like Rome, the population bore the cost through higher prices and lower real wages. Sound familiar? Different metal, same mechanism. By 1821, Britain returned to the gold standard, but the debt burden had already been reduced in real terms. History was repeating. Now, let's look at the most recent example before today. The United States in the 20th century. In 1945, after World War II, U.S. federal debt reached 119% of GDP. That level was considered unprecedented. The solution wasn't default. It wasn't austerity. It was financial repression. From 1945 to 1971, interest rates were held below inflation. Inflation averaged about 4%. Bondholders lost purchasing power every year. By 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar became a pure fiat currency. Between 1971 and 1980, inflation averaged over 7% annually. In just 9 years, the purchasing power of the dollar was cut nearly in half. The debt remained, but its real value was dramatically reduced. This time, the process was faster than Rome, faster than Britain, and you probably remember the consequences. Stagflation, social unrest, loss of trust. 3 times, 3 powers, same sequence. And here's what should terrify you. The United States today is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage. Stage 1 is excessive debt accumulation. In 2000, U.S. federal debt stood at $5.6 trillion. By 2008, it was $10 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. By 2025, over $38 trillion. Check. Stage 2 is dependency on low interest rates. In 2007, interest payments consumed about 9% of federal revenue. In 2024, despite higher rates, they exceeded $1 trillion annually. Check. Stage 3 is central bank intervention. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $900 billion to over $8 trillion. Check. Stage 4 is inflationary pressure. Between 2020 and 2022, consumer prices rose more than 17%. Check. Stage 5 is narrative management. Officials insist inflation is temporary, manageable, under control. Just like every case before. Check. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. And the next stages are predictable. Continued monetary expansion, gradual erosion of purchasing power, silent transfer from savers to debtors. This affects you directly. Your cash loses value. Your wages lag prices. Your savings buy less every year. Maybe this continues for 5 years, maybe 10, maybe less. But the pattern says the outcome doesn't change. 3 times this phenomenon played out. Rome, Britain, the United States before. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed their system was different. Each believed the rules no longer applied. They were wrong every single time. We're telling ourselves the same story now. That technology will save us. That growth will outpace debt. That central banks can fine-tune reality. But the pattern doesn't care about belief. It's mathematical. You cannot create claims faster than real output forever. You cannot suppress interest rates without consequences. You cannot debase money endlessly without social cost. Maybe we find a way out. Maybe this time really is different. But the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. And history says about to relearn a lesson written into the ruins of every empire that tried to erase its debts quietly. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past. And if you understand that pattern now, you won't be surprised by what comes next. And here's the deeper layer most people never see. Because the mechanism operating now is more sophisticated than anything Rome or Britain ever attempted. The Federal Reserve isn't clipping coins or suspending gold outright. It's doing something far quieter. It's altering the relationship between time, money, and obligation. When interest rates sit below the true rate of inflation, debt doesn't disappear on paper. It dissolves in real terms. Every year, inflation runs at 4%, while bonds pay 2%. The real value of that debt shrinks. That gap is not an accident. It is policy. In 2020, the Federal Reserve cut rates to near zero and expanded its balance sheet by over $3 trillion in a matter of months. That wasn't stimulus. It was triage. The U.S. Treasury issued debt at a pace never seen outside of world wars. And the buyer of last resort was the central bank itself. That's not a conspiracy. That's public data. When a central bank creates money to absorb government debt, the debt hasn't vanished. It's been spread across the currency base, spread across you. Stage 6 is where the pattern tightens. It's socialization of loss. Asset prices inflate first. Between March 2020 and December 2021, the S&P 500 rose over 110%. Housing prices rose more than 40% nationally. Those who owned assets benefited. Those who didn't fell behind. This is how invisible debt erasure reshapes society. Wealth concentrates. Inequality widens. Political pressure builds. Rome saw bread riots. Britain saw unrest among industrial workers. The United States sees polarization, strikes, and declining trust. Different forms, same cause. Check. Stage 7 is currency normalization, not collapse overnight. Normalization downward. Since 2000, the US dollar has lost roughly 40% of its purchasing power. Since 1971, over 85%. Check. This is how a reserve currency ages. Slowly at first, then faster. The pattern says reserve status delays consequences, but it magnifies them when they arrive. Rome's denarius circulated across the Mediterranean. Britain's pound dominated global trade. The dollar underpins energy markets, debt markets, and global reserves. That reach allows more debt and more delay. But it also means the impact is global. And here's the part that should unsettle you most. Every previous empire believed monetary control gave them immunity. Rome believed debasement could be calibrated. Britain believed paper could always be redeemed later. The United States believes inflation can be dialed up and down without consequence. But the pattern says control erodes before confidence does. And once confidence breaks, it breaks quickly. In 2022, when inflation officially crossed 9%, the Federal Reserve was forced to reverse course. Rates rose from near zero to over 5% in 18 months. That wasn't a choice. It was necessity. And the cost was immediate. Bank failures, bond market losses, trillions erased in asset value. That's what happens when decades of invisible debt erasure collide with reality. You need to understand where this leads, not hypothetically, historically. When interest costs exceed political tolerance, governments choose inflation. In 2024, U.S. interest payments surpassed defense spending, over $1 trillion annually. That number grows automatically as debt rolls over at higher rates. The pattern says one of two things happens next. Either rates are suppressed again, restarting inflation, or austerity is imposed, triggering recession and unrest. Rome chose inflation, Britain chose inflation. The United States has always chosen inflation. Check. And this is where it becomes personal. Your savings account earning 1% in a 4% inflation environment loses 3% of purchasing power every year. Over 10 years, that's nearly 30% gone. Not stolen, not taxed, diluted. Your wages adjust slower than prices. Your cost of living rises before your paycheck does. That gap is how debt is erased. Quietly. Reliably. Every empire learns the same lesson. The bill always arrives. The only question is who pays it. Now zoom out. Look at the global system. Since 2008, global debt has risen from roughly 170 trillion to over 310 trillion by 2024, more than 3 times global GDP. That debt cannot be repaid in real terms. It can only be restructured, defaulted on, or inflated away. The pattern says inflation is the chosen path, not hyperinflation, not collapse tomorrow. Controlled erosion. But control weakens over time. It always does. This is why the next phase matters. De-dollarization isn't about replacing the dollar tomorrow. It's about reducing dependency, BRICS trade agreements, energy transactions outside the dollar. Central banks accumulating gold at the fastest pace since the 1960s. These aren't coincidences. They are signals. Rome saw provinces demand taxes in kind. Britain saw colonies trade outside sterling. The United States is seeing alternatives emerge, slowly, then suddenly. And here's the final warning embedded in the pattern. The later the stage, the fewer the options. Early on, reform works. Late, only dilution does. By the time Rome attempted Diocletian's price controls in 301 AD, inflation was already entrenched. Britain's return to gold in 1821 came after the debt burden had been softened. The United States' future adjustments will follow the same logic. Stabilize after erosion, not before. So when you hear reassurances that inflation is under control, understand what that really means. Controlled relative to collapse, not controlled relative to purchasing power. When officials say the system is stable, they mean it's functioning. Not that it's fair, not that it's sustainable forever. The pattern doesn't promise disaster tomorrow. It promises decline unless interrupted. An interruption requires pain politicians rarely accept voluntarily. This is the quiet truth behind how the Fed is invisibly erasing $38 trillion in debt. It's not a single policy, it's a sequence written into history. Rome ran it, Britain ran it. The United States is running it now. Same playbook, larger scale, faster feedback, global consequences. Maybe this time the cycle bends. Maybe technology offsets decay. Maybe discipline returns. History allows for hope, but it doesn't forgive denial. The pattern says erosion accelerates once trust frays, and trust is already thinner than it appears. You don't need to predict the exact year. You just need to recognize the stage. Because once you see the pattern, you stop being surprised. And when the next shift comes, whether it's policy reversal, inflation resurgence, or systemic stress, you'll know it wasn't random. It was the continuation of a process that began long before you noticed. Written, not in headlines, but in numbers, in dates, in decisions that seemed temporary until they weren't.